Sennacherib at once looked into the occult meaning of this event and decided that it was a good omen. The very gods, he believed, were so impatient to see the canal in use that they had caused the breach in the sluice gate. Yeah, those gods are always up to something. Let me skip just a bit. In 681 BC, Sennacherib's son conspired against him. After Esarhaddon came the melancholy Ashurbanipal. So Esarhaddon took over the throne. Then Ashurbanipal took over the throne. He was patron of the arts and letters, under whom the empire reached its peak. Thereafter, it swiftly declined as more and more of the subject peoples revolted, and nomadic barbarians, the Cimmerians and Scythians, swept down from the north. In 612 BC, an alliance of Scythians, Medes, and Babylonians conquered Assyria. There it is, 612 BC. In assailing Nineveh, the Medes took advantage of a flood on the Tigris to mount battering rams on rafts. The Allies captured the capital and blotted it out. A ferocious yell of triumph went up from the Assyrians' victims. Woe to the bloody city! Nineveh is laid waste. Who will bemoan her? Thy shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria. Thy nobles shall dwell in the dust. Thy people is scattered upon the mountains, and no man gathereth them. Be nice, or people will hate you. It's the lesson of the Assyrians. They were extremely brutal, vicious culture, and eventually it ended. Eventually it came to a damn end. 2 centuries later, when Xenophon's 10,000 Greeks, mercenaries, passed that way, Nineveh lay in ruins. 2 centuries later. And the memory of the scourge of Assyria was already fading from the minds of men. In fact, I don't think we knew too much about it, little hints in the history books and stuff, until we had deciphered some writing, some text or something in the early 1900s. And then we were able to read some of this stuff, and then some archaeological finds and stuff. But it had been forgotten to some great extent, the Assyrian Empire and Nineveh. Apart from this and that hint here and there, from which we had little puzzle pieces that we again put the story together. At the time of Assyria's fall, a Chaldean adventurer named Nabopolassar had seized the rule of Babylonia. Under him and his son, the second Nebuchadnezzar, the dynasty ruled much the same area as the former Assyrian Empire. Now, Babylon is a city between the Tigris and Euphrates River in what is Iraq today. Babylonia was the larger, the greater area. It was Babylon proper was a city. Babylonia was the greater area ruled by Babylon. In Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, the inner city was a slightly distorted rectangle, about 1.5 miles east to west, and 4/5 of a mile from north to south, so nearly a mile north to south. The Euphrates flowed diagonally through the city from north to south, dividing it into the smaller new city on the west and the larger old city on the east. Moats carried and divided the waters of the Euphrates around the inner city, making 2 triangular islands of it. Both parts of the city were cut up by a number of broad avenues, crossing almost at right angles, and named for, what were they named for? Karl Marx Street, Revolution Street? No, they were named for the gods. Marduk Street, Shamash Street, and so on. The most important street was the so-called Processional Way, running north and south through the old city, 400 or 500 yards from the river. Its true name was, got this, the street on which may no enemy ever tread. Interesting. We have a street that you just, if you're not a good guy, you can't even set foot on it. It's the name of it. Okay. Processional Way embodied a marvelous Mesopotamian invention, paving. It was paved with limestone flags, and under these, large flat bricks set in a mortar of lime, sand, and asphalt. Along this street, wagons bearing the images of the gods were wheeled during religious processions. Such paved processional ways were a regular feature of Near Eastern cities. The Hittite capital of Hattusis had one as early as 1200 BC. paved processional way. At Ashur, the processional way had a pair of grooves in the pavement for the wheels of the sacred wagons, to assure the gods a smooth, safe ride. Because their gods were actual statues and idols and stuff. This was perhaps the world's first railroad. The rails were cut into stone or brick. Not really a rail. After all, it would not do to have a god's wagon get stuck or his statue be jostled. He would not like it any more than a modern mortal likes a flat tire. Okay? And there is no telling what an angry god might do. Aha! They did have to be fairly careful when they were taking the gods out on processional walk. One time the drunk was driving the wagon and the wagon veered over to the side and the statue fell off and broke, and then pestilence and plague and drought. We skipped just a bit. For centuries, paving seems to have been confined to processional ways. Little by little, it was applied to other important thoroughfares, and then to heavily traveled stretches of road outside the main cities. But not until Roman times did any government undertake to pave intercity roads over the entire lengths. So they did have pavement, even of roads outside of cities. But the Romans took it a whole new level. The roads of the earlier empires were for the most part not paved, merely graded. These dirt roads had an advantage over paved roads. They were easier on the hooves of horses than paved roads would have been. Now, we've come about a way to deal with that in the modern world, in the last few hundreds of years or whatever. They put horseshoes on, rings of steel. But it wasn't always possible. When the condition of such roads became bad enough, the officials rounded up corvées, French word, C-O-R-V-E-E-S, of grumbling peasants and compelled them to fill in the holes. Same thing with the canals. The canals were upkept in the same way. The minor streets of Babylon were probably a tangle of alleys in which mud brick houses were jumbled every which way. The Chaldean kings may have entertained advanced ideas of city planning. They entertained these ideas, but they met the same difficulty that has plagued municipal authorities ever since. That it is easy to proclaim a fine city plan, but much harder to make people obey this plan when it does not suit them. An enormous double brick wall surrounded the inner city. The outer city was 20 to 25 feet thick and probably 2 or 3 times as tall as it was thick. 60 feet tall, maybe. The inner wall was thinner but loftier, and the outer wall was heavy but lower. Now, the reason you'd want it that way is because you would want your attackers on the outer wall. If they do breach your wall and they're coming over it, you want to have an advantage over them with your second wall. And it doesn't have to be as thick, battering ram-wise and stuff, but it's got to be taller. There's a reason for that. These walls were of a type that builders of cities and castles standardized back before 1000 BC and continued to build down to the coming of cannons nearly 3 millennia later. The shape of this standard wall was determined by the availability of stone and brick. The main wall was a solid structure, so thick that attackers could not easily break it down and defenders could move about freely on its top. Along the outer rim of the main wall ran a much smaller wall called a parapet. This was a mere foot or two thick and 6 feet high. Its upper edge formed a square zigzag pattern called a battlement or crenellation. The crenels, or notches, in the battlement were low and wide enough so that an archer could shoot through them at foes on the ground below. This is all normal. While the merlons, or tooth-like projections, the things that go up, were large enough so that the archer could duck behind them when not actually loosing his shaft. Along the east bank of the Euphrates, now, like I said, this design was used way up until they started using cannons in the 1300s and stuff. So if you think that sounds like a normal and obvious design, true, and it lasted for thousands of years. Along the east bank of the Euphrates, several square miles of suburbs formed a huge right triangle surrounding the inner city. A pair of mighty crenellated walls protected the area also. Additional walls lined the river banks